Hello, and thank you very much for coming along. Today we consider the question, what do we learn from this global virus about moral authority in times of crisis? In recent weeks, we've witnessed dramatic clashes of ideologies, classes, races, and competing visions for the future of a post-pandemic world. The clashes were triggered by white police officers, once again, behaving brutally beyond all bounds of their authority and common human decency. Specifically, the horror and outrage of the murder of George Floyd under the knee of a Minneapolis police officer on May 25th provoked a global wave of anger against the brutality of white supremacists in uniform and the militarization of the police in the United States and around the world. The outrage was compounded by the President of the United States when he staged a fake news photo op in front of a church near the White House. The public park Trump crossed for this photo op had to be forcefully cleared by U.S. military troops acting as police. Religious leaders and parishioners were incensed by this flagrant abuse of power. But the religious leaders were not alone. Former and current military leaders expressed their disgust and dismay as well. In effect, the president has now become the provocateur in chief, creating chaos instead of leading the country as a whole toward a resolution of our current conflicts. In the words of one senior military leader, President Trump has become, quote, a threat to the Constitution.
The former Trump Defense Secretary, James Mattis, has just come out with a jaw-dropping statement. This is pretty stunning, right? This is a person who had come into this administration at the beginning, stood by him, and his words will stop you in your tracks. Let me read some of the real meat here. He says, quote, "When I joined the military some 50 years ago, I swore an oath to support and defend the Constitution. Never did I dream that troops taking that same oath would be ordered under any circumstance to violate the constitutional rights of their fellow citizens, much less to provide a bizarre photo op for the elected commander-in-chief with military leadership standing alongside. We must reject any thinking of our cities as a, quote, battle space that our uniformed military is called upon to, quote, dominate. At home, we should use our military only when requested to do so, on very rare occasions, by state governors. Militarizing our response, as we witnessed in Washington, D.C., sets up a conflict, a false conflict, between the military and civilian society. It erodes the moral ground, but ensures a trusted bond between men and women in uniform and the society they are sworn to protect and of which they themselves are a part." And Mattis then goes on to say, quote, "Donald Trump is the first president in my lifetime who does not try to unite the American people, does not even pretend to try. Instead, he tries to divide us. We are witnessing the consequences of 3 years of this deliberate effort. We are witnessing the consequences of 3 years without mature leadership. We can unite without him, drawing on the strengths inherent in our civil society. This will not be easy, as the past few days have shown, but we owe it to our fellow citizens, to past generations that bled to defend our promise, and to our children." And he concludes, quote, "We know that we are better than the abuse of executive authority that we witnessed in Lafayette Square. We must reject and hold accountable those in office who would make a mockery of our Constitution. At the same time, we must remember Lincoln's better angels and listen to them as we work to unite. Only by adopting a new path, which means, in truth, returning to the original path of our founding ideals, will we again be a country admired and respected at home and abroad. It is a pretty stunning thing, the president's former defense secretary calling for the rejection of the president. And it isn't just Mattis. Over the past couple of days, 2 former Joint Chiefs of Staff have criticized the president's threat of using the military and overruling governors to put U.S. military troops in American cities. Retired Admiral Mike Mullen, retired General Martin Dempsey, both saying, quote, our fellow citizens are not the enemy. And it comes as the current Defense Secretary, Mark Esper, split with the president today, saying he does not believe that at the moment the military should be intervening to stop the protests.
It seems that the movement by many in the military command to question the president's actions started with a statement by retired Admiral Mike Mullen.
In a stunning rebuke of the elected commander-in-chief, as we know, several generals, from former Secretary of Defense James Mattis to ex-Chief of Staff John Kelly, have taken a stance against how the president has been handling this crisis. But it was our next guest, retired Admiral Mike Mullen, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, who started this public conversation with an article titled, I Cannot Remain Silent. And now he tells our Walter Isaacson why.
Thank you, Christian and Admiral Mike Mullen. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Walter. It's good to be with you.
When you watched the video and saw what happened in Washington, D.C. when U.S. troops were clearing that space in front of the White House, what did you think?
Well, I was stunned, like many people, and it was hard for me to find words at that moment to really accurately state how I felt. It was when I was very young, my last year at Annapolis, I literally was dating my wife, Deborah, not my wife at the time, but we were in the spring of '68. Martin Luther King was killed in April, and Bobby Kennedy was killed the day I graduated. In that April timeframe, we were going out. She was locked down in the streets of D.C. The National Guard was deployed. Tanks were in the street. The town was burning. And that's one of the things that immediately flashed back in my head. And then to fast forward, obviously, to last Monday, we were borderline on using active duty troops, treating our own people as the enemy. And that's what really tripped it for me in terms of coming out publicly. But I actually thought that we were getting to a point where the country was in jeopardy, which is why I spoke. Last week, we saw an officers' revolt. You were among the first, but there was General Mattis, General Kelly, Admiral McRaven, General Colin Powell, General Martin Dempsey, who is another former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, like you are, General Michael Hayden, and now even today, General Petraeus. Is there any precedent for this? Certainly not in recent times that I'm aware of. There have been other times when they've been, I guess they've been characterized as the revolt of the generals or the revolt of the admirals. I know Admiral Burke in the mid-50s led what was described that way, but certainly not in my time that I'm aware of. The country's got huge challenges. COVID has exposed a lot of that. The issue of racism, the disproportionate impact of COVID on the African-American, minority communities and the African-American community in particular, the disproportionate treatment or ability to get decent health care, and obviously the incredible display, the unbelievable display of a Black man being murdered in front of our eyes, which speaks to the whole issue of the police behavior, brutality, and that's got to stop. There's a lot going on right now, which we need to address as a country. And this moment speaks to a lot of that, certainly involving the military in this as well is yet again another step, and potentially politicizing the military is really, in the end, why I spoke up.
But this revolt of the four-star officers, is that appropriate? I mean, aren't military leaders supposed to be subject to civilian command and the command of the commander-in-chief?
Yes, it's a great question, Walt, and it is one that has concerned me for a long time. I mean, part of the challenge I had personally was I had spoken against retired military types who had spoken out. Sort of the marker for me was the Iraq War, and it's seemingly just grown ever since that time. So I'm mindful of that. I'm very guarded about that, and it's why I haven't said anything up until this point. And I've got senior military retireds, including when I was on active duty speaking against this, who pointed out they're citizens of the United States. And I think that clearly is true. And as I never questioned that. That said, it is the fact that we are military or were military members that gets focused on. And it gets to the point of your question, which is the military is, the active duty military works for the President of the United States. The active duty military doesn't vote on policy. It basically gets told, here's what we're going to do, and it carries out lawful orders. And somebody that's in a very, very tough spot right now is General Milley, the current chairman, because he's the one that has to do that, give his advice in private and carry out what the president decides. And I'm sympathetic to that because I had that job. I think his job is probably more difficult than anybody so far, save his predecessor, General Joe Dunford, who also worked for President Trump.
This revolt of the officers, will it matter?
I think I can ask that question, or I would ask that question about, will this time matter? I think it would be very sad if everything that has gone on in recent weeks doesn't matter. And by matter, I mean essentially move forward on constructive change on all of these major issues. I think the answer to whether it matters or not for the military is whether the military is able to keep itself out of the politics, stays out of the politics, in which case this participation by myself and others could be said to have made a difference.
He made the statement very clear in print, in fact, and has backed it up since with statements to the press. Others came forward as well and expressed their alarm for the country and the state of the American democracy.
You've listened to all the stories, you've heard what your former colleagues and retired military are doing. You came out pretty early against all of this. I just wonder what motivated you. What was the moment that caused you to write your statement in the press?
Well, Christiane, it's always good to see you and to be with you. This is a really important moment in our history, in the entire history of the United States, from my perspective. And I think the juxtaposition of the president depicting himself as a law and order president, depicting himself as the ally of the protesters, while literally just a couple hundred meters away on the other side of Lafayette Park, riot police are beating and driving American citizens who have peacefully gathered to protest massive social injustice that has been endemic in this country now for centuries, exercising their First Amendment rights, being driven with tremendous violence, actually, as the president is talking about being a law and order president, and ultimately the ally of peaceful protests and peaceful protesters. That image, that juxtaposition to me was absolutely horrific. And that's what caused me to begin the process of writing.
Let me just quote a little bit of what you wrote. It was called a moment of national shame and peril and hope. You said shame. The slide of the United States into illiberalism may well have begun on June 1st, 2020. Remember that date. It may well signal the beginning of the end of the American experiment. That is pretty dire. What exactly do you mean by the beginning of the end of the American experiment?
Well, we as a nation have always valued, at the very soul of who we are, we've always valued the rights of the individual citizen. At the very top of that value chain for us is the capacity of Americans to speak their mind, to speak freely, to have freedom of speech, our First Amendment rights. And enshrined in our Constitution is that amendment, is that capacity. And look, Christiane, we're at a terrible moment in this country right now. 107,000 dead, going on 2 million infected, over 40 million unemployed, our economy in very dire straits, the killing of George Floyd, which is really just emblematic of centuries of racism in this country. The intersection of those have created an enormous moment of internal introspection, or it ought to, for Americans.
And these admirals and generals were not alone. The expression of regret and apology went right to the top of the current military hierarchy.
You know, we could go through about 7 days in a row here where some high member of the military has tried to do something to basically assuage the protest movement.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we know what was happening last week, where we had military leaders from the Pentagon and from the National Guard who were working behind the scenes, desperately trying to get National Guard soldiers into D.C. and National Guard troops around the country in an effort to keep President Trump from invoking the Insurrection Act. That was one thing that was very clear by late in the week, and that was the military, both the civilian and the uniformed leadership, did not want the Insurrection Act. General Milley, his decision to come forward with and speak out today in this pre-taped message to National Defense University, though, look, he is not immune to the criticism that he was receiving for being with the president when that photo op happened at St. John's Church more than a week ago. There was criticism on social media, in the press. There were retired generals and admirals. People were speaking out about the fact that the military was being pulled into politics. And I can tell you, after covering the Pentagon for 15 years and being through a number of chairmen of the Joint Chiefs, that's something that many of them hold as sacrosanct. The fact that the uniformed military leadership are not supposed to be dragged into politics. We heard about it all the time from Milley's predecessor, General Dunford. General Milley has not been as outspoken about it, but here in this address today, he said he apologized. He called it a mistake and said that he was concerned about the fact that there was the perception that a military leader was being drawn into politics here.
And good evening once again. Day 1240 of this Trump administration, 144 days to go until the presidential election. Donald Trump is now trying to keep the outrage over the killing of George Floyd and the calls for justice from engulfing his presidency and his campaign for re-election. Many inside and outside the administration have conceded his response thus far has been out of sync with much of the nation. He has declared himself the president of law and order, sometimes just tweeting out that phrase. Now, in an interview with Fox News, he's openly questioning the motives behind the protests that have erupted on America's streets for nearly 3 weeks.
I think you had protesters for different reasons, and then you had protesting also because, they just didn't know. I watched it very closely. Why are you here? And they really weren't able to say. What we saw was a terrible thing. And we've seen it over the years. We haven't, this was one horrible example, but you've seen other terrible examples. We can't let something like this, where you have a bad apple, go out and, destroy the image of of millions of people that take really good care of us. And then you have a movement where they say, let's not have a police department.
Our NBC News colleagues who cover the White House for us report that aides to the president are divided on how he should respond to the demonstrations 18 days in, that he's caught between those who want him to, quote, calm a country in the grips of a pandemic, economic uncertainty, and civil unrest, and those who want him to lean into aggressive tactics. The report indicates Trump's unwillingness to come down on one side or the other. That has frustrated his allies, led to a slow, sometimes contradictory response. Quote, These aren't my voters, the president has said repeatedly, dismissing protesters in discussions with aides about how to respond. One advisor said the president and his allies should be taking on the Black Lives Matter movement by calling it a front organization for a lot of crazy leftist ideas that are unpopular. Trump has yet to give any kind of speech on race or unity or race relations, preferring to bring these topics up at smaller, more carefully curated events. Politico is reporting that some people of color in senior roles at the White House say the administration had, quote, a huge opportunity and botched it. Tomorrow, Trump will have a chance to speak to a large group when he addresses graduates at West Point. He'll be speaking to over 1,000 newly minted second lieutenants in the midst of an extraordinary falling out with the nation's military after the Pentagon's top general publicly apologized for showing up with Trump at that now famous photo op minutes after federal authorities forced protesters off public grounds. That was followed by scathing criticism from ex-Defense Secretary Jim Mattis, as well as several former commanders and military officials. As Trump has sought to navigate difficult points in his presidency, he has often compared his performance to past presidents and most recently to Abraham Lincoln.
I think I've done more for the black community than any other president, and let's take a pass on Abraham Lincoln because he did good, although it's always questionable. You know, in other words, the end result.
Well, we are free, Mr. President.
But we are
did
free.
Pretty well.
You understand what I mean?
Yeah, no,
After Trump compared himself to President Lincoln favorably, thinking he had done as good a job as Lincoln, the Fox interviewer had to remind him that Lincoln had freed the slaves. In the face of all this discouraging news, some news anchors look to journalists from the past for signs of hope. What have they seen in recent events? Bill Moyers is called upon in this regard by many current journalists.
Put into context what we're seeing today. What went through your mind first as we see George Floyd's final farewell and being laid to rest?
The first image I had, and I'm very glad to be with you, Christiane, the first image I had was of a conversation I did many years ago with one of the wisest men of our times, the legendary mythologist Joseph Campbell, who said to me, if you want to change the world, change the metaphor. And I think the funeral that we saw today is perhaps the beginning of changing the metaphor that we use to address civil rights from the valley of despair, let's say, because very little has changed over the last 25 years, despite all the civil rights legislation. That is, very little has changed in the daily lives of most African Americans, to perhaps a metaphor of, you know, the beginning of change with the Sam Cooke song that they sang at the funeral a few minutes ago. A change is going to come. And when I look at these young people, particularly, and many of them are millennials, as I have three millennial grandchildren, many of them are millennials who've been rather lethargic in the past few years about the power of politics to change anything. And I see them now looking beyond this moment to the country that we're going to become in their adult majority if we don't change. So I hear the sounds of change. I've heard them many times in the last 50 years, but something about this is bracing.
Well, Bill Moyers seems to see some optimism ahead in the youth.
I believe that it's up to us, the youngest generation, to stand up and ignite a movement that will change the mindset of every person on this planet. In fact, I believe it's what we were born to do. And the reality is, you know, we don't really have a choice. The earth is calling us. Future generations are screaming at us.
We're fighting against these dirty politicians, these corporations that want to desecrate our sacred land. But I'm saying no. And many people, millions of people in this world are saying no.
When I was 9, I got together with 13 of my friends or so, and we got pesticides out of our parks. We called ourselves the Earth Guardians. And now there are hundreds of thousands of young people all over the world that are rising up as Earth Guardians in communities all over the place. One dope thing that I'm trying to do is I'm trying to sue this government. Myself and 20 other youth plaintiffs are filing a lawsuit to hold our federal government accountable for violating our constitutional inalienable right to life, liberty, and property because of their inaction on climate change.
I got involved with climate activism when I was 12 years old. I joined a campaign to stop a development proposal in my home state of Maine. When I got to high school, I wanted to continue doing this work and I wanted all of my friends to be involved, but there was no environmental club. So I started one and we called it the Climate Action Club. We raised enough money to install solar panels on our school. We had the largest reusable bag campaign in Maine. We also galvanized this really big movement in our community. Then I went to Harvard and I co-founded Divest Harvard. At our first meeting, we had 10 people in a room and none of us knew what we were doing. Now, in our third year, we have 70,000 people that have signed on to our campaign.
I'm very proud of the youth that are standing up. I'm very proud to see the essence in the children because that's beautiful and we cannot take that away.
Yes, the youth movement has been strong, especially on the climate front, and they're making alliances now across the country and across the world on the questions of racism and inclusion. They've in fact started to teach themselves through self-guided learning and teaching during these times of global lockdown and isolation. Under conditions of enforced isolation and lockdown, the youth have found ways to assert solidarity and share the joy of art, even in the face of their own fears, anxiety, and anger. Despite conditions of enforced isolation and lockdown, these youth have found a way to express joy and affirm solidarity with all others who are struggling now for justice, equity, and inclusion.
But it's what is in your heart, that fire lit within inside you. And that fire is rising in the youth, and you could feel it. You could feel it in the ground. You can hear it in the trees. You could feel it in the air.
It's a revolution that'll ignite the compassion in every person's heart so that they consider our future with every decision they make. So the time has now come for us to take matters into our own hands. So now let me ask you, who is ready to stand up, unite together across generations, and start a revolution that is so loud, so provocative, and so unquestioning that we will be impossible to ignore? Let's make it happen.
Before all the world, the youth challenged the fatal myopia, greed, and childishness of the Trump generation. It did this long ago. Before Trump assumed the presidency. He was elected in November 2016, but didn't assume office until January 2017. And over a month before he came into office, the youth of the world responded and rejected this form of leadership. Can grown-ups catch on? Can they catch up with the youth? What have we learned from this global virus about moral authority in times of crisis? We've learned that it must respond beyond hatred and militarized power to a just, equitable, inclusive, and youth-inspired world.